In this video, I want to talk about basic input. Now, as you get more and more proficient in programming, you're going to discover that there are many ways to get input. And input is basically some kind of information that your application is going to use. You can get input from a keyboard, input from a file, input from a database, input from a keystroke, something, a mouse click. Those are all forms of input. I'm very familiar the way I program. I tend to do a lot of automation. So a lot of my input is coming from text files, and that's normal. But in this video, I want to talk about input from the keyboard. Now, if you're familiar with Linux, Linux talks about what is called standard input. And what standard input is input coming from the keyboard. I'm going to do some demonstrations using the Python shell, using the Zybook IDE, using the REPL it IDE, and to kind of demonstrate that it's all pretty much the same. Now, Zybooks may be a little bit different, but when we talk about standard input, we are really talking about input coming from the keyboard. So let's do some demonstrations. Let's start with our Python shell. And a program would be fundamentally boring if I kept on having to type or assign a variable. So let's say, for example, we take base. We'll do the area of a triangle. And if I always have to hard code or put the values within the programs eventually are just going to be worthless. We need some method in which we can get input or values into the application. And as I said before, that could be, we can be grabbing input from a database, from a file. We're going to be grabbing data from the standard input or our keyboard. So I'm just going to type for base 4, and this is important. We've seen this before. If I say base here, and if I type the base, we can see that within the code, it would take the integer value of 4 and put it into base. And if I was to do the exact same thing, but maybe do it with a floating value, say 4.1, and do the exact same thing here, we can see that it's going to float. Now, when we do basic input, we basically say we're going to take a variable, and that variable is going to be derived from input, like that. So this little command, little function, say input. Now, watch what's going to happen on the screen. It looks like the screen just stopped. Actually, the screen did stop. It's waiting for us to type a value in there. It's waiting for that input from the standard input or from the keyboard. So here, if I put 4, okay, it returns back to the prompt. And now if I say base, show me the value of base. Now, very subtly, look at the difference between this base and this base. And this is probably the most important concept in this discussion about standard input or input. This base now is actually a string. If I do a type on base, it's showing it as a string. I can't do math on that input because that now has become a string. That's important. If there's one thing you draw from this video, this discussion, is that this input command inputs a value as a string. Whatever variable I put here, if I use just the plain input, it's going to put it as a string. So let me clear the screen real quickly. So we can basically get any value using that in command. Let's say, for example, I want to input, actually input a string. I can say shape is equal to triangle is equal to input, right? It's sitting there and waiting for the input. Now, if I say triangle, it comes back. And if I say, what's the value of shape? It's showing me as a triangle. If I type shape, again, you're seeing that it's coming in as a string value. And that, again, that is critical. And in a little bit, I'm going to show you how we can actually change that. The next thing is we don't like this. If I say shape is equal to input, it's just sitting there. There's no, for lack of a better word, there's no dialogue between the program and the person typing in the input. So I can basically, again, do this, and we've seen that. But what we can do with input is we can give it a prompt value, a value that would be exposed back to the user and say, okay, give me something. Let's create a dialogue here. And to do that, that's fairly simple. Again, we say shape is equal to input. Now, within those brackets, put a command line. I'm sorry, put a string, something that kind of explains to the person what they're looking for. And here we can say, please type in a shape. Right? A little bit of a dialogue here. And if I hit enter, it's still waiting for me, but now it's a little bit more user friendly. We're telling the user at the keyboard to what to type in. Now, this literal string doesn't change anything. That's not going to be populating, but it's, again, given a prompt. If I say, what is the value of shape? Showing me as a triangle. And again, we're seeing it as a string. Let me exit out of here and clear my screen again. Start over. So when you're doing true interactivity with the keyboard, whether you're using with this, this Python shell or you're going to be using Replit, you can put a prompt in there. It makes it a little bit easier to understand what you're typing in, what you're not typing in. However, in the zyBooks IDE, and I'll do some demonstrations of that in a second, we don't have that luxury. We can't put a prompt in because zyBooks uses an auto-grader system. So the auto-grader system populates or inputs those values on its own. It doesn't really look for a prompt. Again, I will do some demonstrations on that in a second. So what about this problem of the input always taking the string? That could be, especially if, say, we want to put the value of a base and the height and we don't want them as a string. That's an easy enough fix. So here we can say base is equal to, and here's where we're going to typecast. We're going to tell the input to change the value of the string we're going to type in, convert it to an integer. So we're going to say int, convert the input from a string to an integer. So we put int, open paren, input. And again, we could put a little command prompt here, tell us what we're doing here. Please type in the value of the base. And make sure that our parentheses, our open parens, close parens line up. And if I hit enter there, it's sitting there waiting for the prompt, giving me a little bit more information to provide. Okay, please type in the value of the base. And this one I'll say, again, I'll say 4, right? It returns something. Now, if I say, show me the value of base, and I type the value of base, we can then see that base is an integer. We can do the exact same thing with float. We can tell the input to convert that string that it's grabbing from the keyboard, convert it or typecast it from the string to the float, and then put it into the variable. And I'll do the exact same thing. So if I say base here, I say equal. Now if I say float and do the exact same thing I did before, make sure my open and close parens lined up. So it's basically saying grab something from the keyboard, which is, we now know is going to be a string, but before we put it into base, typecast it or change it into a float. Right? And here we'll say 4.1. We want a nice float number there. Hit enter. We look at base. Base is 4.1. We say type base, and it's shown as a float. So these are some of the methods that we do to typecast. We know that the string from the input is going to be a string, right? But by putting it into the function int, it's basically saying convert that into an integer, then put that into the variable. Or if we do float, we look at this line here, right? So we're saying grab the string, convert it to a float, then put it into the integer. I'm sorry, into the variable. And here, same thing, right? Grab the string from the keyboard, convert it over to an integer, put it into the variable. Now, let's take a look at this inside Replit. All right. Let's do our area of a triangle. But this time, instead of us hard coding the base and height, we're going to ask for an input here. So we're going to say, and for argument's sake, we're gonna treat these as floats. So I'm going to say base is equal to float input. Please type in the base. Make sure our open and closed parens line up. I'll put another variable in here. I'll say height is equal to float input. Please type in the height. Make sure our open and closed parens all line up. They look good so far. And then let's do our area of a triangle. And we say area is equal to, we'll say 0.5, basically 1/2 base times height, times base times height. And then we're going to say print the area. In another video, we will talk about basic output. But what this program should basically do is it's going to prompt us. It's going to take the string from the keyboard, put it into base, prompt us, take the string from the keyboard, put it in as a float, put it into the variable. And then it's going to calculate the area of a triangle, which is 1/2 or 0.5, 1/2 base times height. So let's run this. Give it a second. Okay, please type in the base. We'll say 4. Please type in the height, 5. And it basically says the area of this triangle is 1/2 base time height. So 4 times 5 is 20, times half is. So the area of this triangle is 10. Now, let's do this in the Zybooks IDE. And to save a little time, I'm going to use our old friend cut and paste. So I'll go to Zybooks, and I'm first going to run it incorrectly. I'm going to tell you it's incorrectly. Remember what I said, Zybooks does not like these prompts. The Zybook IDE relies upon auto grading. So there's nobody there sitting there typing in the information. So these prompts really don't do anything. Well, actually, if you put a prompt inside your Zybook submission, it's going to come up as an error, not as an error in the interpreter, but you're not going to get full credit for the submission. So let me show you the correct way to do it. But first of all, let me show you the broken way of doing this. So up here we have base time height. We would actually put the input here. So we're going to say 4 and 5. And then when we run this program, you can see that it's saying, please type in the base, please type in the height 10.0. It kind of looks like we want, but it's wrong. This answer here would cause the auto grader to come back and say, what you did was wrong. We were looking for 10.0 and you gave us this string. So this time, all I need to do is remove those prompts. So I removed the prompts. And again, this is only for the Zybook IDE because of the auto grader. And now if I run the program with the exact same values, give it a second, and it comes back that the program would display 10.0. And the auto grader would be happy, and the auto grader say, we were looking for 10.0. You gave us 10.0. You get full credit for this assignment. Now, we actually did cover a lot with this video talking about input. It wasn't just a question of input. The biggest thing that we get from the input that we should take away from this video is that input will always take from the keyboard and treat it as a string. We have to typecast it. We have to tell the interpreter to take that string and then convert it into an integer or into a float. If we don't do that, we will run into problems. One more. Okay, so we're back to the Python shell. Let me do a really quick demonstration to just really reinforce the concept that an input inputs a string, and then we have to either do a float or an int to convert that value into what we want to use. And I'm going to say base is equal to input, and I'm not going to worry about any kind of prompting here. I know what I'm looking for. Hit enter. It's waiting for my keystroke. I'm going to say 4. And just to prove a point, I'm going to say base. You notice the single quotes here. And if I type base, it's telling me it's a string. So I'm really, lack of a better word, I'm really beating this horse dead. But let's pretend I'm just going to ignore it. I don't care. You're telling me it's a string. I don't care. I know a 4 is a 4. Well, let's see what happens. I'm going to say height is equal to 5. And again, if I look at height, we see it as a 5. It looks like a number. And then we're going to say type. Okay, so five's an integer. Now I can do the area again. I'm going to say area is equal to 0.5 times base times height. All right, same formula we've been using. Now, bear in mind that height is a integer. We see it here, but base is a string, and then we have this literal 0.5. Let's see what the interpreter tells us. Oh, the interpreter says, no, you really were wrong here. You cannot multiply that base times the height times a literal. So again, input takes a string. If we want to convert it to an integer or convert it to a float, then we have to take that little bit of an extra step. So with that being said, let's go learn something.